February 3, 1945. Manila, Philippines. Major General Robert Baitler stood at the edge of the city and understood that what was about to happen in Manila was going to be unlike any battle his 37th Infantry Division had fought in the Pacific Campaign. Manila was a city of 1 million people. It was the capital of the Philippines, one of the great cities of Asia, with a Spanish colonial heritage that had given it architecture and cultural institutions that placed it among the most beautiful cities in the world. The Manila Hotel, the Intramuros walled city, the legislative buildings, the universities, the cathedrals, the residential districts of Malate and Ermita represented centuries of civilization that the war had so far left intact. The 100,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors who were defending Manila against MacArthur's return had been ordered by the Japanese High Command to abandon the city without fighting. Manila had been declared an open city in December 1941 by MacArthur himself as he retreated, and the Japanese command understood that fighting for the city would produce exactly the kind of civilian casualties and physical destruction that the Japanese government was trying to avoid as it considered the increasingly unfavorable strategic situation. Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi had other ideas. Iwabuchi commanded the Manila Naval Defense Force, approximately 17,000 sailors who had been assigned to defend the city's naval installations. When the Japanese army began its planned withdrawal from Manila, Iwabuchi refused to leave. His reasons were partly tactical, he believed the city could be held, and partly personal, he did not intend to abandon the naval installations under his command without a fight. His decision condemned Manila to destruction. The American force that entered Manila on February 3 consisted of the 37th Infantry Division coming from the north and the 1st Cavalry Division coming from the east, converging on a city that was simultaneously a military objective and a humanitarian crisis of the first order. The humanitarian crisis was the immediate priority. The University of Santo Tomas internment camp in the northern part of the city held approximately 3,785 American and Allied civilians, men and women and children who had been interned since the Japanese occupation in 1942 and who were in varying states of physical deterioration after 3 years of inadequate food and medical care. The 1st Cavalry Division had been ordered to reach Santo Tomas as quickly as possible, before the Japanese guards could carry out the executions that intelligence reports suggested were planned. The 1st Cavalry's advance on Santo Tomas became one of the most celebrated actions of the Manila campaign. The flying column that led the advance covered more than 100 miles in less than 15 hours, arriving at the university's gates at 9 p.m. on February 3 with the garrison still intact and the prisoners still alive. When the gates of Santo Tomas opened and the first American soldiers entered, the prisoners who emerged were not the healthy adults who had entered 3 years earlier. They were hollow-eyed, many of them skeletal, moving with the careful deliberateness of people who had been on starvation rations for so long that the instinct to conserve energy had become automatic. Some could not walk without support. Children who had been born in the camp had never seen the outside world. What they saw when the gates opened was American soldiers. Not the idealized American soldiers of propaganda, but the actual men, dirty and tired from the advance, armed and professional and absolutely certain that nobody in that camp was going to be harmed. The liberation of Santo Tomas was not the end of the Manila battle. It was the beginning of it. Iwabuchi's naval defense force was distributed across the southern portion of Manila, in the Intramuros walled city and the surrounding districts of Malate and Ermita, where 300 years of Spanish colonial construction had produced buildings whose walls were thick enough to serve as defensive positions. The Manila Hotel, the legislative buildings, the Metropolitan Theatre, the Manila Cathedral, all of them became fortifications in a battle that neither side had sought but that Iwabuchi's refusal to follow orders had made inevitable. The battle for Manila lasted until March 3, 1945, 28 days of the most intense urban fighting in the Pacific War. American forces cleared the city block by block and building by building, using tactics that were recognizably similar to the urban clearing that would define the next generation of American military operations but that had not been systematically developed or trained for in the Pacific War's island campaigns. The cost of the Manila battle was staggering and was distributed across the three parties who fought it in proportions that reflected its specific character. American casualties were approximately 1,010 killed and 5,565 wounded, significant but manageable given the scale of the operation. Japanese casualties were approximately 16,000 killed, virtually the entire force that Iwabuchi had committed to the defense. The civilian casualties were the most devastating component of the Manila battle's cost. Approximately 100,000 Filipino civilians were killed during the fighting, the majority of them murdered by Iwabuchi's forces as they withdrew through the civilian districts, taking revenge for the failure of their defense on the population that surrounded them. The atrocities that Japanese forces committed against Manila's civilian population in February and March 1945 have been described by historians as among the worst war crimes of the Pacific War and have remained a source of grief and anger in the Philippines for the 8 decades since. The buildings of Manila that had survived 4 centuries of history were destroyed in 28 days. The Intramuros, the walled city that had been the center of Spanish colonial power in Asia, was reduced to rubble in the fighting. The Manila Cathedral, whose stones went back to the 16th century, was shattered by artillery. The legislative buildings that had been the hope of Philippine democracy were burned. The residential neighborhoods of Malate and Ermita, where Manila's professional and artistic class had lived, were destroyed by fire. When the battle ended and the destruction could be assessed, Manila was the second most destroyed Allied capital after Warsaw. The city that MacArthur had called the Pearl of the Orient had been reduced to ruins by a battle that Japanese discipline and obedience to orders could have prevented. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, commanding the 6th Army, reviewed the damage to Manila after the battle and wrote an assessment that captured the specific tragedy of what Iwabuchi's decision had produced. The city was destroyed unnecessarily, Kruger wrote. The orders were given and the orders were correct. Manila should have been evacuated. The civilians should have been protected. The buildings that represented 4 centuries of civilization should have been preserved. One admiral's refusal to follow orders produced this. That will be his legacy. Kruger was right about the legacy. Iwabuchi died in the fighting, killed by American forces in the final days of the battle before the War Crimes Tribunal that he would certainly have faced could do so. The prisoners liberated at Santo Tomas and at the smaller Los Baños camp, where a separate operation by the 11th Airborne Division liberated more than 2,100 additional prisoners, received the care and the recovery time that 3 years of internment had made necessary. The men and women and children who had entered Santo Tomas in 1942 and emerged in February 1945 carried the physical and psychological marks of their internment for the rest of their lives. The liberation of Manila and the freeing of its prisoners was one of the most significant American achievements of the Pacific War in its humanitarian dimension, the direct rescue of more than 5,800 American and Allied civilians from Japanese captivity. It was achieved at a cost that reflected the character of the Manila battle, significant American military casualties, overwhelming Japanese military casualties, and the irreplaceable cost of a civilian population that was killed and a city that was destroyed by Japanese forces whose commander had chosen to fight rather than follow the orders that would have prevented it. The battle also produced one of the most extraordinary rescue operations of the Pacific War, the Los Baños raid of February 23, 1945. The Los Baños internment camp was located approximately 40 miles south of Manila, past Japanese lines, reachable only by an operation that required the simultaneous coordination of airborne troops, amphibious assault, ground forces, and Filipino guerrilla fighters in timing so precise that a failure in any component would have triggered the execution of the 2,100 prisoners before rescue could be completed. The 11th Airborne Division executed the Los Baños raid with a precision that military historians have described as one of the finest small unit operations of the Pacific War. Paratroopers jumped at dawn, guerrillas attacked from the jungle, amphibious vehicles crossed Laguna de Bay, and the ground force advanced simultaneously from the north. The entire operation, from the paratroopers' jump to the last prisoner being loaded into an amphibious vehicle, lasted less than 2 hours. Every one of the 2,100 prisoners was liberated. Not one was killed in the operation. General Colin Powell, who as a young soldier had studied the Los Baños raid as a model of combined arms coordination, later described it as the most successful rescue mission in military history, a description that reflected both its operational excellence and its outcome. The soldiers who fought the Battle of Manila and conducted the Santo Tomas and Los Baños liberations were MacArthur's veterans, men who had fought from New Guinea to Leyte to Luzon, who had been in the Pacific for years and who understood that the liberation of Manila represented both a military objective and a personal fulfillment of the promise that had been made when the Philippines fell in 1942. MacArthur had said he would return. He had returned. And in the ruins of the city that the Japanese had destroyed rather than surrender, among the prisoners who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this moment, the promise was kept. The Philippine people who had supported the American cause through 3 years of occupation, who had fed and sheltered American prisoners at risk of their lives, who had fought as guerrillas and gathered intelligence and maintained the connection to the Allied command that made operations like Los Baños possible, paid a price for their loyalty that the American military could not fully repay. 100,000 of them died in Manila in February and March 1945. Their city was destroyed around them. The civilization that 3 centuries of history had built was rubble. What was not destroyed was the connection between the American and Filipino people that had been forged in the shared experience of the war, in the mutual sacrifice and the mutual protection and the mutual recognition that what each side valued was worth fighting for. The prisoners who walked out of Santo Tomas and Los Baños were alive because Filipino civilians and guerrillas had helped them survive 3 years of occupation. The Filipino civilians who survived the Manila battle were alive in many cases because American soldiers had interposed themselves between Japanese forces and civilian populations. That connection survived the war and has defined the relationship between the United States and the Philippines in the 8 decades since. Manila was rebuilt. It is today a city of more than 10 million people, one of the most dynamic cities in Asia. The Intramuros has been partially restored. The Manila Cathedral stands again. The ruins of 1945 are the foundation of the city that exists today, as ruins so often are, and the people who walk through the Intramuros carry with them, in the specific way that national memory works, the knowledge of what happened there in February and March 1945 and what it cost. The Americans who fought for Manila and liberated its prisoners carried that knowledge differently, in the specific way that soldiers carry the things they have done and seen, as something that cannot be fully described to someone who is not there, but that shapes everything that comes after. They liberated the prisoners. They destroyed the force that had refused to surrender. They paid the cost that the battle required. And then they moved on to the next island and the next battle and the final approach to Japan that the liberation of Manila had made possible. That was Manila. That was what MacArthur's veterans did in February and March 1945 in the ruins of the Pearl of the Orient. They kept their promise.